Well, joining me live now is the Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume. Thanks so much for your time, Jane. First of all, GDP figures, we've seen another interest rate rise. We'll get to hear from Governor Philip Lowe tomorrow. All this in the context of an upcoming federal budget as well. Do you think this budget needs to include cuts?
Well, certainly when the Albanese government were in campaign mode prior to the election, they said that they had the answers to tackle the cost of living. What we saw yesterday was a fourth consecutive rise in the interest rate, in the cash rate since the Labor government came to office, 200 basis points, an additional 200 basis points. And of course, that for a family with a $750,000 mortgage equates to an additional $900 per month in repayments. We know Australians are doing it tough right now. You know, it's not just mortgage repayments, it's also the cost of the bowser, it's the cost at the grocery checkout. The Albanese government said that they had the answers to the cost of living pressures that Australians were facing, and yet we haven't seen an economic plan to deal with those cost of living pressures, to deal with inflation. Because unless the government has a plan to deal with inflation fiscally, well, then it forces the RBA to do all the heavy lifting, and that's what we're seeing play out right now.
Would interest rates have been lower under another coalition government?
Well, certainly the budget would have had a much smaller deficit. We know that the Albanese government has some pretty big spending plans, and indeed some of those are being announced just today.
Well,
we would like to see that the budget, we would like to see, well, when we went to government, when we went to the election, we know that we were predicting spending, government payments, to be much lower than they were under an Albanese government, and that's exactly what's happening. We want to see that the Albanese government can make considered and prudent and responsible decisions around this budget to ensure that fiscal policy is moving at the same pace and in the same direction as monetary policy. Otherwise, Philip Lowe is going to be forced to keep pulling on that monetary policy lever much harder, and that's going to feed into the pain in the pockets of ordinary Australian families when they're paying their mortgages.
Well, what fiscal levers are you talking about? What should Anthony Albanese be pulling on in this budget?
Well, that's up to the government. That's not up to the opposition to make their policies for them. But we would like to see more attention paid to an economic plan to reduce the cost of living, an economic plan to reduce inflation, and using fiscal policy effectively and prudently and responsibly to do just that.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of figure out what you're saying here, though, because Chris Richardson, a respected economist, has said, you know, a lot of this is actually out of government's hands. So whatever levers Anthony Albanese is able to pull on, they are still at the fringes, aren't they?
No, not at all. In fact, the signals that a government can send by managing the budget prudently, by managing the government responsibly, by managing the budget responsibly, will be part of those signals that they're sending to the RBA. In fact, what we're seeing from the Albanese government is quite opposite. You know, Philip Lowe, back in July, said that inflationary expectations is one of the things that they take into consideration, one of the things that drives inflation, and one of the things that are taken into consideration when they make decisions about interest rates. And yet we saw the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, almost immediately after talk about hyperinflation and prices increasing by 20%. Now, when a policymaker makes those sorts of ill-considered comments, that actually drives further inflation. It doesn't diminish the chance of reducing the cost of living, reducing inflation. So we'd like to see a little bit more of a considered approach, a more mature, a more fiscally responsible approach coming out of this government in order to make sure that Philip Lowe and the RBA doesn't have to keep raising rates to compensate for the fact that the government isn't doing its fair share of that heavy lifting.
I mean, you've seen the budget, you know what's in there in terms of the last budget that you handed down. Is there anything that, you know, you would cut? Is there an obvious cut there? Any low-hanging fruit?
Well, it's not up to me now. That budget is done and dusted. Now it's up to the Albanese government and its economic and fiscal team, its economic and finance team, to make sure that the budget that it presents not only addresses a cost of living, not only presents an economic plan that will help ordinary Australians, whether it be at the bowser, whether it be at the grocery checkout, whether it be when they're paying their mortgage, to help ordinary Australians deal with those
how do you do that, Jane Hume? Because you're talking about two different things in many ways. You're talking about, wanting people's cost of living to be eased immediately, which would mean a direct subsidy, but then you don't want to add to those inflationary pressures, and you want long-term budget security and getting that debt down. Those two things at the moment seem like they're completely non-complementary.
No, that's not at all the case. In fact, when the opposition first went into opposition, the first policy that we announced was to double the pension work bonus, which was a very modest proposal to allow older Australians that are on the pension to get back into work. That would help them with cost of living pressures, but more importantly, would also help businesses fill those skills gaps, fill those labour shortages. That has been on the table now for 2 months. And yet Labor has done nothing about it. In fact, instead, they held a jobs summit which didn't actually have any outcomes this week that could have filled those labour shortages. Yeah, sure. That's what we were hoping to come out of the jobs summit.
Didn't they announce that pensioners can earn more and work more?
In fact, the announcement that they made was less generous and therefore less effective, is less of an incentive for pensioners to get back into the workforce, and therefore they won't fill those skills shortages. So we think that that was a terrible opportunity missed by this government. In fact, they could have supported that private members' bill, private senators' bill that was put up just this week, debated just this week. We could have passed it today. We could have passed it. It could have already been done, and pensioners could be getting back to work right now. But instead, we're now waiting for the Albanese government to stop sitting on its hands and get this done. But even if they do, the scheme is less generous. It'll be less effective than it could have been.
The cut in the fuel excise expires at the end of this month. That is not going to be extended by the Albanese government. It doesn't look like it. Is that the right course of action?
Well, when we put that fuel excise cut in place, it was to deal with the cost of living pressures that we saw Australians facing back earlier in the year. We put a sunset clause on it on purpose so it could be reassessed by the government of the day. That's the Albanese government's job to do right now, is to reassess, considering the circumstances at the time. But we made that decision based on the economic circumstances at the time when we were in government.
Well, petrol prices have come down, so is it the right time to have that full fuel excise returned?
I would love to be able to give you an answer, but unfortunately that's not something I have the power to control. That's a decision for the Albanese government and a decision that they need to have made. They've said that they're not going to extend the fuel excise cut. That's certainly going to feed into the cost of living pressures that are facing ordinary Australians today, whether it be
has the opposition's position changed on this in the last week, though? Because your leader did say that it should be extended. You're saying now it's up to the Albanese government. It seemed to change.
I don't think he did say that it should be extended, Laura. I think he said that this was a decision for the Albanese government, one that they had to make. Now, they've made that decision, and that's the decision that they have to live with. We made decisions when we were in government, and we lived with those decisions. That's up to the Albanese government to do the same.
All right, can't wait to see this next budget. It's going to be a very interesting one at a very interesting time. Jane Hume, we'll speak to you soon.